Welcome to another episode of the PS We Expire podcast. I am your host, Morgan Mutzinger, and today I am sharing with you 5 things that I would tell my younger self. Not that my younger self would listen necessarily, but these are the things that I would tell younger Morgan. I am nearing 40 now, and I know that I still have a lot of life ahead of me, but I have learned some lessons in the past, like 5 or 6 years that have really shifted the way that I think about life, the way that I think about myself, the way I show up in my life. And so I want to share those with you today. And somehow, if I'm able to share these with younger Morgan, I'm sharing them with her as well. So thanks for joining me for this episode. I'm so glad that you're here. So this episode is all about the things that I would tell my younger self. And I've recorded this a couple of times and I keep deleting it because I don't think I really thought about who younger Morgan was. So first, I want to just address her and talk about what she was going through, because if you can see yourself in some way in younger Morgan, then this list of 5 things that I would tell my younger self is going to make a lot more sense. And I mean, I tell myself these things still, so they're not irrelevant if you don't happen to find something in, what I was like a decade ago or so resonates with you. So I'm not saying that, like, if younger Morgan doesn't resonate with you, you might as well just turn this episode off. I'm not saying that at all, because these are applicable to everybody. But when I think about younger Morgan, I think about a woman who was really overwhelmed a lot. I had, let's see, if I'm thinking a decade ago, I had 2 kids that were 5 and 2. And I was navigating still the early days of my oldest daughter's diagnosis. So being, a special needs mom and fighting with insurance companies and trying to make sure that I advocated for her well, and also, like, oh man, not sleeping well at all, and just chasing children a lot, dealing with like IEP stuff at the school, and a lot of worrying, and a lot of feeling out of control of my life, feeling like where was I? It was like I was so wrapped up in my role as a mother, especially, that it was like, where did Morgan go? Where did this girl who was ambitious and happy and outgoing and, really seemingly unconcerned with so much of life, I was just kind of like dancing to the beat of my own drum. Where did she go? I'm really grateful that I feel more like myself now than I did then. And some of that is a result of, some of that is a result of my kids getting older. So I have 3 kids now. They're 7, 12, and then Annie would have been 15, but she was 14 when she passed away last year. And even just being out of like the stage of them being so dependent on me has shifted things and has freed things up a bit. But even that has been, fairly new, even since Annie passed away. So there's the demands on my time and attention are different now than they were before. However, I did find ways to navigate my way back to myself through some of those really tough years. And some of that was like really learning how to advocate for my own needs. Maybe that should have been the 5 things that I would, part of the list of the 5 things I'd tell my younger self, but it's not this time around. I'm sure I'll do another 5 things I'd tell my younger self. But so that's the Morgan that I'm talking to. This is the Morgan that I'm telling these 5 things to, in an attempt to help her come home to herself, help her advocate for her own needs, and help her just think about life differently, help her tap back into the joie de vivre, help her tap back into the joy of living. So these are the 5 things that I would tell my younger self. Number 1, failure does not exist. Younger Morgan had no idea that she would start multiple businesses and a couple of them would be, you know, quote unquote, total failures. Like they weren't making money. She didn't know what she was doing. I mean, all of them really. I didn't know what I was doing when I started my businesses, and I learned along the way. And when I really had this shift of like that failure, we get to choose how we view whether or not something turns out the way that we were hoping, the way that we were planning, the way that we were expecting. We get to choose how to label that. And many times we are told to label that as failure. Even think about this in terms of relationships. Like we have this idea that longevity is the metric of success in our relationships, whether they're our platonic or romantic relationships. We think the relationships we have forever are the successful ones. So if they end, then it's a failed relationship. If I close my business, it's a failed business. If I get a D on my test, that's a failed test. And the shift from believing that that's failure to really opening up my mind to this isn't failure, because what failure does is it makes me stop. It feels loaded with shame, and it feels loaded with I'm not enough. And failure as learning, failure as being a good scientist. Like scientists, when we're doing experiments, failure is so important. Failure is, you cannot get to the end goal. You cannot get to the data that you want without failure. Failure is a necessity. And so maybe it's not even so much the label of failure as it is this mentality around that failure is bad. Failure is amazing. Failure tells you what you need to know. And so I have effectively tried to strip this term from my vocabulary, from my external vocabulary, and then also from that internal dialogue, that it's not failure if it doesn't work out the way that I wanted it to. It's only failure if I let it stop me. And many, many people will be so afraid of things not turning out the way that they want to, that they just don't ever attempt to do it. And I would tell my younger self, please do not let that stop you. Do not let that stop you from pursuing the things that you want to do, because failure is not bad. Failure is necessary to be able to learn more about yourself, to learn more about the thing that you're doing, and to direct you on the way towards the things that really light you up. So, number one, failure doesn't exist. Number two, worrying about something doesn't stop it from happening. I don't know why we think that worrying is doing something. Like in our minds, if we go through all of the scenarios that could happen, somehow we think that that is activity, and it's not. It doesn't actually exist. Our brains are using so much energy trying to think about what could go wrong, and so much time doing that, that we lose that amount of time in action. The biggest thing that I can think of is like, I worried for a long time about how Annie was going to die. I worried a lot about what the last months and years would look like. I worried about the moments, like, how is this going to happen? And all of the worrying that I did not actually help me make decisions to make her life what I wanted it to be like, and the best that it could be for her. It also didn't stop that from happening. It many times what it did is it pulled me out of the present moment with her. Worrying I'll just say it like this. Worrying is different than logically thinking through the risks and putting plans in place to avoid those risks. There's a big difference there. So I bet you could even feel in your body the difference between worrying and logically thinking through what things could go wrong. Tim Ferriss has a really great activity that he does that's called fear setting. So instead of goal setting, it's fear setting. And effectively what you're doing is you're writing down the things that you want to do and then what could go wrong. And then you're rating those things based on whether or not you actually have control over that, and also how likely is it to happen. So the things that are most likely to happen to go wrong, those are the things that you give attention to ahead of time to say, this is what I would do if that goes wrong. So you're not wasting a ton of energy trying to not make that happen as much as you are giving yourself evidence that if those things happen, this is how I'm going to deal with it. And I know that I'm going to be okay. It's a really phenomenal way to think about stopping ourselves in the cycle of worrying and really actually take that energy and put it towards like managing risk somehow that also doesn't require us to continue to ruminate on it because you've actually systematically thought through what could go wrong. And back to number two, it's like, or back to number one, that if we come to it with a mindset of like that failure doesn't exist, it's still just learning, that also will help us to nip the worrying in the bud. Number three, you are not as good as you hope you are, and you are not as bad as you believe yourself to be. You are not as good as you hope you are. You are not as bad as you believe yourself to be. The reason why I like this one is that, oh man, I used to think that at my core, I was like not good. And a lot of that really had to do with some of my religious upbringing. But I think that many of us, if not all of us, do feel like this from time to time. And maybe a lot that we think like if people really knew us, that they would see how bad we are, that they would see how selfish we are, that they would see how dysregulated we are. They would see how moody we are. They would see how spiteful we are, resentful or bitter or angry or whatever. What I have found from not only my own self-exploration of all like the deep parts of myself, or, in I guess pop psychology, we would call it like the shadow self. I like to think about it like going into the basement of my personality and not being afraid to shine a light into all the corners, into all the cobwebby corners, or open up the boxes and see like, oh, what's in here that I've kept tucked away for a long time, or that I've kept hidden from other people or kept hidden from myself. That the people, the more that I've talked with people, the more that I've done this work myself, the more I understand that like we often think that we are worse than we are, because that's what shame will tell us. So when we have parts of ourselves that we have kept hidden away that we don't bring into the light, we often think that we are alone in that, and that we think that we are worse than everybody else. The more that I have spoken with people who have shared some of those like deep, dark spots, even just in the sharing, it unshames things quite a bit. But then when they also understand, oh, you're not alone. You're not alone in feeling these things. You're not alone in wondering these things or having these ideas sometimes. Like it unshames us even more. And we recognize, oh, like I'm not as bad as I thought I was. And then on the flip side, I think many of us try and overcompensate for our feelings of not enoughness by constantly trying to like talk about our best points. And we get really bristly if anybody points out ways that we have been selfish, or ways that we have been less than loving, or ways that the choices that we're making are affecting people negatively. So anytime that we, get that kind of feedback and we take it as like a huge blow to our ego or identity, we can trust that we are not balancing this very well, that we either have a really fragile ego where people giving us feedback to something that we could be doing better or differently really crushes us, or when people say things that we take in and we use that as more evidence that we are terrible people. Neither of those things are helpful. What we need to recognize is that we are a common human, that many people struggle with many of the same things that we do. And there are some people who are really not going to understand some of the stuff that you're going through, the ways that you think about things, but I guarantee that you are not the only one who does. And I know that this is kind of vague and it's not, real specific, but I will say, like, I guess as an example, I've shared with some friends, and then also I've shared on this podcast before that, like when things were super duper overwhelming in my life, I had times when I literally just wanted to run away from my life, that I imagined getting in my car and just driving and then not stop driving, and somehow like adopt a new identity and pull all the money out of my account, and like somehow go into like my self-made witness protection program because I just wanted to escape my life. And I know for a fact that other people feel like that in their lives sometimes and have felt like that. And in me telling that, I understood that I'm not alone, and that also what I was feeling, my feelings of overwhelm and disconnection from myself and from others and disconnection from purpose, contributed to me feeling like that, and that other people feel like that sometimes. So that's a really basic example of like, you're not alone. You're not as good as you hope you are, and you are not as bad as you believe yourself to be. Number 4, this one is really difficult for me. Still, I would tell my younger self this, and I tell myself this a lot. Stop trying to find people who understand you. Find people who love you. If someone is committed to loving you, they may not understand you, but it is irrelevant. I think the reason why this one makes a big difference for me is that many times the people who misunderstand me are the ones that I try the hardest to get to understand me, but they are not committed to loving me no matter what. It's this idea of like, why do we, when we get 10 positive comments about something and 1 negative comment, why do we spend so much time agonizing over the 1 negative comment and thinking like, well, if this person just knew me, if this person could just like get inside my experience, if this person could just hear a little bit more, that they would understand what I'm saying and that they would validate me. Stop it. Stop it. Focus on the 9. Focus on the 9 that are telling you, I am here for you no matter what. I am committed to understanding you to the best of my ability. And I'm committed to loving you, even if I don't always understand what you're doing. Because the reality is that none of us can get into another person's experience, and nobody can get into yours. And, some of this is like, the more that we become committed to really listening to that internal guidance system, really understanding how to use this internal compass, and committing to a path that sometimes only you can see the next step on. When we commit ourselves to that, we have to become less concerned with whether or not other people are going to support that. God, this one sucks. Sorry, younger Morgan, this one sucks. Stop trying to find people who understand you. Find people who love you. That doesn't mean that the people who love you will always agree with you, but there's a different vibe with it when there are people who are committed to misunderstanding you. Usually it's because something that you're doing, agitates an experience that they've had in the past, or agitates a point of fragileness in their own ego. A lot of times it bumps up against a wounding of theirs in some way. And many times it has very, very little to do with you. It has a lot to do with that other person. So stop trying to get people who misunderstand you to understand you, and just find the people that love you, the people that will cheer you on no matter what, the people that are there for you day in and day out, that have got your back, that are your cheerleaders. Invest more of your mental and emotional, spiritual energy into those relationships, and stop chasing the people that are committed to misunderstanding you. Number 5, stop waiting. Stop waiting for others to make changes. Stop waiting for you to be discovered. Stop waiting to be invited. Stop waiting for other people to make the plans. Stop waiting for other people to recognize your strengths. Stop waiting for other people to validate you. Stop waiting. Stop waiting. Start doing. This life is so short. It is so short. And when we are waiting for others, I think that many times it's because it is our procrastination tool of choice. Like, if I can put the responsibility on somebody else, to make the plans or to advocate for my health or to, meet me in this particular way or for them to change, that we don't have to risk not having things turn out the way that we want them to. We don't have to risk uncomfortable feelings if we can just, be in this status of waiting. If we're just always waiting, then we're kind of like sitting on the fence. We're not ever having to experience the discomfort of, making a mistake or making a wrong choice or having things not turn out the way that we want them to, or I hope that they would. We don't have to worry about being the ones to take on the responsibility for our own lives. Stop waiting. You are the only one who is going to be living your human experience. You are the only one who is going to be at the end of your life recognizing the areas of regret or recognizing the areas where you wish that you had done something differently. You're the only one who is going to have to look yourself in the eye and admit to yourself the places where you couldn't move forward with courage. And that's not to say that moving forward into, especially, big change doesn't come without fear, but that we find our purpose and we find our meaning and we become so committed to that thing that we don't let fear be the thing that stops us. So number 5 is stop waiting. Like, seriously, what are you waiting for? Are you waiting for the right weather? Are you waiting to have enough money? Are you waiting for so-and-so to get on board? Are you waiting for this other person to change? Are you waiting for your circumstances to improve? Stop it. There's this is a total tangent, but I just got to tell you about it anyway, because you have to look it up on YouTube. There's this great clip of Bob Newhart, who is a therapist, and his advice to the woman who comes into his office is, she says, I can't stop worrying about this thing. And he says, okay, I've got 2 words for you. Stop it. And sometimes I think we need to just tell ourselves, stop it. Like, stop waiting. Why am I waiting? What would possibly make this so that I could move forward without discomfort? That will not happen. If we are venturing into the unknown, there will always be a level of discomfort. There will always be a level of uncertainty. There will always be a level of fear. And so many of us are letting that stop us from pursuing things that really make us feel alive. Number 1, 5 things I would tell my younger self. Number 1, failure doesn't exist. Number 2, worrying about something doesn't stop it from happening. Number 3, you are not as good as you hope you are. You are not as bad as you believe yourself to be. Number 4, stop trying to find people who understand you, find people who love you. And number 5, stop waiting. Maybe this will be helpful to some of you. This is a good way to wrap up this episode. I was thinking the other day about, this like belief that we are entitled to happiness, even in our laws that we have written into this country, that every person has the right to pursue what makes them happy. And I've been thinking about, like, what exactly is happiness? What is the definition of happiness? And I'm going to write my own definition for myself. And I would encourage you to do the same. I do not believe that happiness is a feeling. I don't think that happiness is synonymous with the feeling in our body of being warm and content and joyful and, like that everything is going our way. If we are pursuing that definition of happiness, we will be perpetually disappointed. And because the human experience is always a conglomeration of the positive and the negative, it's always the ebb and flow of feeling on top of the world and then also feeling like you're in the depths and that you're going to feel like shit forever. This is the human experience. My definition of happy, as I have grown and changed and learned over the years and become more of myself, my definition of happiness is that I open myself to life fully. My definition of happiness is that I am consistently learning and growing. That's happiness for me. It's like happiness is the umbrella under which I allow myself to learn and grow in all things. And I know through experience that learning and growing will always have a measure of pain. Always. Some of the greatest times of growth have been when I have been at my lowest. Some of the most amazing experiences of joy have walked hand in hand with grief. So my definition of happiness and my commitment to happiness is my commitment to allowing myself to feel and experience whatever comes up. As well, the reason why I wanted to share that with you is because if we're not clear on what our own personal definition of happiness is, then what do we actually have to tell our younger selves? If we're not driven by a purpose that isn't so much about the end result, but is driven by the experience of getting to wherever we're trying to go, then we are going to be disappointed frequently that we're not going to learn how to navigate when things don't go our way. So I guess maybe that's the big number one that I would tell my younger self is get a really good grasp on what happiness means to me. And don't be afraid to let myself feel everything that I feel. What are some things that you would tell your younger self? What are some things that if you could go back in time, you would be able to look yourself in the eye, your younger self in the eye, and give her or him a message that you know you really need to hear? What are the things that you have learned over the years that have impacted you the most? So these are just 5 of mine that I would tell my younger self, and that sometimes I still tell myself. And I'm sure I'll do another episode, 5 more things that I would tell my younger self. Because there's a lot of lessons that have come up that I know I would not have learned any other way than the way that I have learned them, usually through hard stuff. So thank you for joining me for this episode of the PS We Expire podcast. If you have not taken the time to given the show a rating or a review on Apple, Spotify, or given us a subscribe on YouTube, I would really appreciate if you did that. It's just a way, obviously, for my ego to get bolstered. But the more important way the more important reason why is because then more people get to hear the things that I'm sharing. So if you have found any of the things that I'm sharing to be valuable and helpful to you on your personal growth journey, please go ahead and do that. Share with a friend an episode that has made a big impact on you, or a clip from YouTube or whatever. So before we go, P.S.